There is something about a father holding his child's hand in a cold January wind that stops the world for just a second. It does not matter if that father is a farmer, a teacher, or the future king of England. That small, quiet moment carries a weight that no crown could ever replace. And on a gray winter morning, when cameras caught Prince William walking back through the palace gates with young George and Charlotte beside him, the whole world seemed to pause and breathe for just a moment. People did not see a prince. They saw Dad. A tired, warm, real dad with windswept hair and two children leaning close to him. Coming home after the holidays were finally over. That image spread across every screen, every newspaper, every conversation. Not because it was dramatic, not because something scandalous had happened, but because it was so deeply, quietly human. And in a world that is always rushing, always loud, always waiting for the next big story, a moment this simple felt like something rare. To understand why that single photograph moved so many people, you have to go back a little. You have to understand who Prince William is today, not just as a royal figure, but as a man who has been shaped by loss, by love, by years of trying to do the right thing in front of a world that never looks away. William Arthur Philip Lewis was born on the 21st of June, 1982, in St. Mary's Hospital in London. The whole country celebrated. Flags went up. Church bells rang. His mother, Princess Diana, held him up at the hospital steps for the cameras while the world fell in love with the small, red-faced baby who would one day be king. From his very first breath, his life was never entirely his own. It belonged in part to the people of Britain and to the weight of history that came with being second in line to the throne. His childhood was unusual in ways that are hard to fully understand from the outside. He grew up in palaces. He attended some of the most expensive and prestigious schools in the world. He was surrounded by security officers, staff, and ceremony from the moment he could walk. But inside all of that, there were also two parents who did not always agree, whose marriage slowly and publicly fell apart, and whose pain played out on the front pages of every tabloid in the world. William watched all of it. He was old enough to understand more than anyone wanted him to. Princess Diana made a decision early on that she would try, as much as possible, to give her boys a life that felt normal. She took them to McDonald's. She let them wear jeans. She took them to theme parks and sat with them on rides and laughed with her whole body. She wanted them to know what the world outside the palace gates actually felt like. And William absorbed all of it. He learned that the world was bigger than the rooms he lived in, and that kindness was not something reserved for ceremony. It was something you carried with you every day. Then, in August of 1997, everything changed. William was 15 years old when his mother died in a car crash in Paris. He was at Balmoral, the royal family's estate in Scotland. He was asleep when it happened, and when he woke up, the world he had known was simply gone. The grief that followed was enormous, not just for him and his brother Harry, but for the entire country. Millions of people left flowers outside Kensington Palace. The sea of bouquets stretched so far it became impossible to see where it ended. For William, that grief did not go away quickly. It settled into him deep and quiet, and it changed the way he saw everything. He has spoken about it in interviews over the years, carefully and honestly, admitting that for a long time he did not let himself properly mourn. He pushed the pain down and kept going because that was what was expected of him. It was only years later, with help and with time, that he was able to face it properly. He has said that becoming a father himself changed something in him. That holding George for the first time made him understand his mother in a new way, understand what she must have felt, what she would have wanted for him. That is the man who walked back through those palace gates in January. Not just a prince, a man who lost his mother young, who fought to find himself inside a role that was chosen for him before he was born, who fell in love, built a family, and is now, every single day, trying to give his children something that feels like a real life, even when the world is always watching. His wife, Catherine, Princess of Wales, has been his partner in that effort for over a decade. They met at St. Andrews University in Scotland, where both were studying. They became friends first, then something more, and their relationship was tested over years before they finally married in April of 2011 in a ceremony watched by billions of people around the world. Westminster Abbey was full. The streets of London were packed, and Catherine walked down that aisle in a dress that took everyone's breath away, and William looked at her the way people only look at someone they truly cannot believe is real. Their first child, George Alexander Lewis, was born in July of 2013. He arrived at the same hospital where William himself had been born, and the tradition of standing on those steps for the cameras continued. George was tiny and wide-eyed, wrapped in a white blanket, held by a mother who looked both exhausted and completely radiant. The country celebrated again. Their second child, Charlotte Elizabeth Diana, was born in May of 2015. She was named, in part, after Diana, a small and beautiful tribute. And their third child, Louis Arthur Charles, arrived in April of 2018, completing the family that William and Catherine had always hoped to build. Those three children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, are at the center of William's world. People who know the family say it clearly and consistently. William is deeply, actively involved as a father. He does school runs. He helps with homework. He coaches football. He makes breakfast. He is not a distant figure in his children's lives. He is present, hands-on, and genuinely devoted to them in a way that is not performance, but simply who he is. The New Year break had taken the family away from London, away from the pressures of royal duties, away from the cameras and the schedules and the endless obligations that come with their lives. For a few weeks, they had simply been a family. They had walked outdoors in the cold air, eaten meals together without staff surrounding them, stayed up late watching films, played games, laughed at things that only made sense to the five of them. It was the kind of time that families need. Not organized, not photographed, not planned for anyone else's benefit. Just real, quiet, ordinary life. But January always comes. The holidays always end. And the world always starts again. When William and the children were spotted returning to the palace, George was walking tall beside his father, dressed neatly, his posture already carrying just a hint of the young man he is becoming. Charlotte was close to William's other side, her expression curious and bright, looking around with the kind of alert energy that has always characterized her. They were not performing for the cameras. They were just walking. But in that simple walk, those who were watching could see something that went far beyond a news photograph. They could see a family returning to duty. A father preparing his children gently and steadily for a life that will ask a great deal of them. A young prince who once grieved his mother in front of the world, now raising his own children with the kind of warmth and steadiness he perhaps always wished he had been given more of. And a future king who, despite everything, despite the weight of history, the scrutiny, the impossible expectations, was in this moment just a dad walking his kids home. The people who saw that image and felt something in their chest were not wrong to feel it. There was something real in that moment, something that reminded the world why, through all the complexity and controversy that surrounds the royal family, there are still moments that simply touch people. Not because of who these people are in terms of titles or power, but because of what they represent in terms of family, of love, of the ordinary beauty of a parent and a child side by side, heading home together. The palace gates closed behind them. The cameras kept clicking for a few seconds more. Then the crowd moved on, and the family disappeared inside. But the image stayed, shared, saved, commented on, talked about in kitchens and offices and on phones on buses all across the world. Because sometimes the smallest moments carry the most meaning. And sometimes a father walking his children home in the January cold is, without trying to be, the most powerful thing in the world. What happened next, once those gates closed and the family settled back into the rhythm of their lives, was a story that continued to unfold in ways both public and deeply private a story of a family navigating change, challenge, and the quiet, steady work of love. The palace has a way of swallowing people whole. Not violently, not suddenly, but slowly, quietly, the way deep water takes something that falls into it. The routines come first, then the schedules, then the obligations. And before long, the weeks that felt so free and open during the holidays are just a memory, something you carry with you like a photograph in a wallet, something you glance at and feel warmly about before putting it away and getting back to work. William knew this feeling well. He had lived inside the rhythm of royal life long enough to understand exactly how quickly normal life could return, and how important it was to hold on to the things that mattered most, even as the machinery of duty started up again around him. He had fought for years to find a balance between who he was as a public figure and who he was as a private man, and that fight never really ended. It simply changed shape depending on the season. January in the royal calendar is always a month of transition. The warmth of Christmas fades. The country goes back to work. And the family at the center of Britain's most scrutinized institution goes back to the business of being visible, of carrying out the engagements, the visits, the speeches, and appearances that make up the formal structure of their lives. But before any of that could begin again in earnest, there was the quieter, more personal task of settling the children back into school. George, who was 10 years old and growing up with a speed that still sometimes caught his father off guard, had returned to Lambert School in Berkshire. It was a school William and Catherine had chosen carefully, looking for a place that could give their children as much of a regular education as possible, a place where they could have friendships, make mistakes, learn things slowly, and exist for a few hours each day in something that felt close to ordinary. George was beginning to develop his own personality in ways that were becoming impossible to miss. He was thoughtful and observant. He liked sports. He was developing the kind of quiet confidence that comes not from arrogance, but from feeling genuinely loved. Teachers who had worked with him spoke warmly about a boy who listened carefully, who was kind to the other children, who had the natural instinct to be fair. Charlotte was 8, and she had long since established herself as someone with a very clear sense of who she was. Even as a small child, she had shown a directness and a sharpness that made people smile. She was not shy. She did not hide behind her parents at public events the way some children did. She looked at the world with open, steady eyes and seemed to be filing everything away for later use. She had her mother's grace and her father's practicality and something all her own, a particular kind of spark that was simply and entirely Charlotte. She had thrown herself back into school life with an enthusiasm that seemed almost defiant of the January gray. And Louis, the youngest, still small and full of the uncontained energy that defines childhood at 5 years old, had gone back to his own routines. The public adored Louis in a particular way, partly because he was young, partly because he had already shown, in the few public moments people had glimpsed him, a spectacular gift for pure, unfiltered expression. His face during the Platinum Jubilee had become one of the most shared images in recent royal memory. Every emotion he felt visible to the entire world in real time. No filter, no caution, just a small boy experiencing things fully and completely. He was the one who still ran to his father, who still grabbed William's hand without thinking about it, who had not yet learned to be careful. William watched all three of them return to their routines and felt the particular bittersweet feeling that parents understand. The quiet pride of watching your children move forward, combined with the almost physical ache of knowing that each step forward is also a step away. He had felt it more sharply since the family had been through a difficult stretch of time. The past couple of years had brought challenges that no amount of preparation could have fully softened, and they had changed the atmosphere inside the family in ways that were hard to describe but impossible not to feel. Catherine had faced her own health struggle with a courage and a dignity that had moved people deeply. When she had shared in the spring of the previous year that she had been diagnosed with cancer and was undergoing preventive chemotherapy, the response had been extraordinary. not just from the public, but from ordinary people all over the world who wrote letters and sent messages and simply said, "We are thinking of you." For a woman who had always been somewhat private by nature, who had worked carefully to keep the line between her public role and her personal life as clear as possible, the experience of being so vulnerable in front of so many people had been both difficult and, in its own unexpected way, connecting. She had chosen to tell her story in her own words, in her own time, and the world had listened with a gentleness that she seemed genuinely grateful for. For William, watching his wife go through that period had been one of the hardest things he had ever experienced. He has spoken carefully and honestly in interviews about how much he learned during that time, about what it means to be present for someone you love when they're frightened, about how you hold a family together when everything feels uncertain, about the way your children look to you for steadiness, even when you are not entirely sure you feel steady yourself. He had taken on more of the day-to-day responsibilities at home. He had been at Catherine's side throughout her treatment, and he had continued to carry out his duties publicly because that was what was required of him, even on the days when it cost something. The return to normal life in January carried all of that history with it. It was not just a family coming back from holiday. It was a family that had been through something real and difficult and had come through it together and was now stepping back into the world with a quieter kind of confidence, the kind that only comes from having been tested. Catherine's recovery had been a gradual and private thing. She had taken the time she needed away from cameras and engagements to heal properly. And when she had started to reappear at public events toward the end of the previous year, people had been struck by how well she looked, not in a superficial sense, but in the deeper sense of someone who has done hard work and emerged with a new kind of peace. She smiled differently. She spoke differently. There was something in her that seemed to have settled, something that had found its footing after a long period of uncertainty. William, standing beside her at those engagements, had shown something too. Not pride exactly, but something close to it. Something like relief. Something like gratitude. He had looked at his wife the way people look at someone they were genuinely afraid of losing. And now, in January, with the children back at school and the calendar beginning to fill with engagements and plans, there was a sense in the Wales household of something like renewal. A quiet, deliberate decision to move forward, not to forget what had happened, because some things change you permanently and you carry them with you, but to build something out of the difficulty, to take what the past year had taught them and use it. William had also been doing thinking of his own during the break. He was a man who had always taken his future role seriously, but who had also spent years wrestling with what that role should actually look like in a modern world. He was not content to simply maintain tradition for its own sake. He believed, genuinely and deeply, that the monarchy needed to earn its relevance, needed to demonstrate its value not through ceremony alone, but through action. His Earthshot Prize, the environmental initiative he had launched and continued to build with enormous energy and focus, was one expression of that belief. He wanted to be a king who actually did something, who used whatever platform and influence he had to push the world, however slightly, in a better direction. During the holiday, away from meetings and briefings, he had thought about the year ahead. He had thought about the engagements he wanted to prioritize, the causes he wanted to push further, the kind of presence he wanted to have, not just publicly, but for his children, for his family, for himself. He had made no grand announcements. He had simply thought and walked outdoors and come back to the table for meals and watched his children play and let himself be still for a while before the stillness ended. The image of him returning to the palace with George and Charlotte had captured something of all of this without capturing any of it explicitly. That is the particular power of a photograph. It freezes a single instant and somehow contains everything that led up to it, even though none of that history is visible in the frame. What people saw was a father and his children. What was actually, there was so much more. Years of grief and growth, a marriage tested and strengthened, a family that had been through the fire and was walking out of it together, Two children growing steadily toward futures that would demand everything they had, and a man at the center of all of it trying, as every parent tries, to do the most important job in the world well. Charlotte had paused for just a moment near the gate, looking back over her shoulder at something. A sound, a movement, something only she noticed. Her expression was unreadable in that fraction of a second. Then she turned back and kept walking close to her father. And William, without looking down, reached across and adjusted the collar of her coat. It was nothing. It was everything. It was the kind of moment that gets lost in larger stories, but is actually the point of the whole story. That was January. That was the return. Not dramatic, not ceremonial, just real, quiet, human life unfolding in the middle of a world that could not quite stop watching, and perhaps was right not to, because sometimes the most important things happen in plain sight, and the only thing required of us is to pay attention. As the days shortened and the cold deepened and the year began to build its pace, the Wales family settled back into the life they had made. Complicated, scrutinized, imperfect, and in its own particular way, deeply, stubbornly beautiful. Time moves differently when you are raising children. The days are long, longer than you expect, longer than anyone warns you about, but the years are breathtakingly short. You look up one morning, and the baby who once fit in the crook of your arm is standing at the kitchen counter making his own toast, and somewhere between that first morning and this one, an entire childhood has slipped past. Parents all over the world know this feeling. It is one of the things that makes parenthood so quietly heartbreaking and so quietly magnificent at the same time. William felt it in the particular way of a father who had been paying attention. He had made a choice early on, a deliberate, conscious choice to be present, to be the kind of father who was actually there, not just in the building, but genuinely there in the room, on the floor, on the pitch, at the table. He had made that choice partly because of who he was as a person, and partly because of who he had lost. He knew, in a way that most people do not have to learn so young, that time with the people you love is not guaranteed. He had learned that lesson when he was 15, and the knowledge had never left him. So when January settled over London, and the children returned to school, and the palace resumed its rhythms, William carried with him a particular kind of attentiveness. He noticed things. He remembered things. He stored away the small details that might seem unimportant, but that he knew from experience were exactly the kind of things you would want to remember years later. The way George's voice had been changing recently, deepening just slightly at the edges. The way Charlotte had started using longer words in casual conversation, testing them out, checking how they felt in her mouth. The way Louis still sometimes reached up without warning and grabbed William's face with both hands to make him look directly at him, as if to make absolutely sure that his father's full attention was present and accounted for. These were the things that mattered. These are the things that no photograph could fully capture and no news story would ever report. These were the things that belonged only to the family, carried privately, spoken about in quiet moments, or sometimes not spoken about at all, simply understood between parents who looked at each other over their children's heads and shared something wordless that said, "This is it, this is the whole point." The world outside continued its commentary. It always did. The image of William returning with the children had generated the usual wave of response. Warm pieces in newspapers about the family's quiet dignity. Social media posts that had been liked and shared hundreds of thousands of times. Opinion columns about what the future of the monarchy might look like through the lens of this generation. There were those who found meaning in every detail of the photograph. Those who saw in George's posture the shadow of the king he might one day become. Those who wrote about Charlotte's expression with the kind of analysis usually reserved for political speeches. And those, perhaps the wisest of all, who simply looked at the image of a father and his children walking together and felt something uncomplicated and good. William was aware of all of it, in the peripheral way that he had learned to be aware of public reaction, present enough to understand it, distant enough to not let it move him too much in either direction. He had spent years learning that particular skill. It was not indifference. He cared, genuinely, about how his family was perceived, about the stories that were told about them, about the narratives that shaped the public understanding of who they were. But he had also learned that you could not chase the narrative. You could not spend your life trying to correct every misreading or respond to every opinion. You could only live as truthfully as possible and trust that the truth, over time, would speak for itself. What he had come to understand more clearly than ever, after the difficult stretch of the previous year, was that the most important audience was not the public. It was the three people who called him Dad. Everything else, the cameras, the engagements, the headlines, the history, everything else was context. What was central was George, sitting across from him at breakfast, asking a question about something he had read. Charlotte, showing him a drawing she had made, watching his face carefully for his reaction. Louis, falling asleep on the sofa with his head against William's arm, completely trusting, completely peaceful. Those moments did not belong to the public. They did not belong to history. They belonged to him and to Catherine and to the children, and they were, he had decided, worth protecting with everything he had. Catherine had said something to him during the quiet of the holiday that had stayed with him. They had been sitting together late in the evening after the children were in bed, the house settled and still around them, and she had said that she thought the hardest part of their lives was also, in a strange way, the most valuable part. That because everything was so visible, so watched, so constantly held up to the light, they had been forced to be more deliberate about who they were and what they chose. They could not coast. They could not be passive. They had to choose actively and consciously every day what kind of parents they wanted to be, what kind of people, what kind of family. And that forced deliberateness, she said, had given their family a kind of clarity that many people never found. He had thought about that. He believed she was right. There was something to it, the idea that the pressure of their circumstances had pushed them again and again toward honesty, toward being real with each other and with their children about what mattered and what did not, about what was worth fighting for and what could be let go. They had not built a perfect family. There was no such thing, but they had built a real one, and that in the end was the only kind worth building. George was at an age now where he was beginning to understand, in a more adult way, what his future held. William had watched this understanding arrive gradually, without drama, like light changing in a room as the day moved. You do not notice the exact moment it shifts, but at some point you realize the room looks different than it did before. George had started asking questions that were more specific, more thoughtful. Not the wide, innocent questions of early childhood, but the narrower, more focused questions of someone beginning to actually grapple with the shape of his own life. William answered them honestly as he could, in language that was appropriate for a 10-year-old boy, but that did not talk down to him or offer false comfort. He had decided, early on, that he would not pretend to George that the life ahead of him would be easy. He would not dress it up or romanticize it. He would give him the truth, alongside all the love and support he could offer, and trust that the truth, honestly given and held with care, was a better preparation than any illusion could ever be. It was what he had wished for himself. It was what he intended to give his son. Charlotte watched all of this with her characteristic quiet intensity. She observed. She processed. She drew her own conclusions and held them with a confidence that was remarkable in a child her age. William had noticed that she often seemed to understand things before they were explained to her, as if she had a kind of emotional intelligence that ran ahead of the conversation, reading the room before anyone else had quite caught up. It made him think of his mother. Sometimes, Diana had had that quality too, the ability to read people deeply and quickly to see what they needed before they said it. Charlotte had something of that, wrapped in a directness that was entirely her own. And Louis continued to be Louis, unchanged by January, unchanged by anything, blazing through each day with the full force of himself, demanding attention and giving love in equal and enormous quantities. He was the one who kept the house from becoming too serious. The one who broke tension with a sudden joke or a completely unexpected non sequitur delivered with total conviction. He was 5 years old, and he was, in William's private opinion, quietly hilarious. As the weeks of January unfolded and the family moved through their days, there were small things that accumulated into something larger. A school concert that Charlotte was preparing for, rehearsing her part with a focused determination that made both her parents smile privately to each other. A football session in the garden on a cold Saturday afternoon, George and William on one side, Charlotte and Louis on the other, the game immediately and cheerfully descending into chaos. A quiet evening when Catherine and William sat together going through old photographs, something she had suggested, a project of sorting and organizing that had turned into 2 hours of sitting side by side, moving slowly through years of images, laughing at some of them, going quiet at others. There were photographs of Diana in that collection. There always were. William had kept them carefully and deliberately, not locked away, but present on shelves, on tables, in the books that the children sometimes pulled down and leafed through. He had never wanted his children to not know who their grandmother was. He spoke about her to them honestly and warmly, sharing the memories he had and the love that had never gone anywhere. George had once asked him, with the directness of a child who has not yet learned to soften questions, whether he still missed her. William had paused for a moment before answering. Then he had said yes, every day, but that missing someone and being at peace with what you cannot change or things that could live in the same place inside you. It had not always hurt the same way it once had. It had become something quieter, something carried rather than something that carried you. George had nodded, with the careful nod of a child storing information for later. Charlotte had slipped her hand into William's without saying anything. Louis had, at that exact moment, arrived from the other room with a sock on his head and no memory of or interest in whatever had just been discussed, and the moment had dissolved as moments do into ordinary life. That was January. That was the family the world had caught a glimpse of in that photograph, walking through a gate coming home. A father with his children in the cold, in the gray, heading somewhere warm. And if you had asked anyone who saw that image what it was they were actually responding to, most of them, if they were honest, would have said something that had nothing to do with royalty. They would have said something about love, about what it looks like when someone is trying their best for the people they love most, about the strange, universal beauty of a parent and a child side by side, and all the ordinary weight and wonder of it. The gates closed. The camera lenses turned elsewhere. The palace absorbed them back into its quiet, vast interior. And life, as it always does, simply went on, ordinary and extraordinary in the same breath day after day, in all the ways that matter most and get noticed least, building something that will outlast the headlines, outlast the photographs, outlast everything except the memory carried by 3 children who knew, without being told, that they were deeply and completely loved. That is, in the end, the only story that has ever really mattered. And it is the one that was walking right there in plain sight on a cold January morning, dressed in a winter coat, holding a small hand, coming home.